She was kept in chains like a beast, towering and silent. He walked through the crowd and offered a single word: Mary. No one saw what he did, but he hadn't come to tame her. He'd come to be saved. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. The cage rattled with each slow, deliberate breath she took. Iron bars bolted into the wagon frame, thick enough for grizzlies. Beasts meant for circus shows or shooting galleries, not people. And yet there she was, a woman, massive, scarred, barefoot despite the rocky mountain ground and wrapped in nothing but tattered buckskin and shame. The mountain air was thin and cold, making each breath visible in ghostly puffs, turning the small crowd of miners and trappers into shadows against the towering pine trees that stretched up towards snow-capped peaks. They called her Mountain Mary, the widow from Bear Creek Canyon. Some said she killed 3 husbands and ate their hearts raw by moonlight. Others claimed she wrestled a full-grown grizzly to death with her bare hands and made her home in its blood-soaked cave. Still others whispered that she could call the legendary beasts from their hidden lairs, the creatures that left enormous tracks in mountain snow and howled from the high peaks on winter nights. But most didn't speak at all. They just stared wide-eyed from beneath fur caps and wool scarves pulled high against the mountain chill, whispering with children pressed close to their sides, seeking warmth around the flickering torches that barely held back the endless wilderness darkness. The mountain town of Silverpoint perched on the edge of civilization like a dare thrown at the wild country. Built where 3 valleys converged, it existed only because silver had been found in the rocky streams and men were willing to die for the chance to pull fortune from the frozen ground. The buildings were rough-hewn log and stone, built to withstand the crushing weight of mountain snow and the howling winds that could strip flesh from bone. Most folks who came here either struck it rich quick and left, or died trying. The smart ones learned to respect what the mountains could do to the unprepared. That no one knew the truth about the woman in the cage, not even the man who dismounted his horse and walked toward her with purpose in his stride and ancient regret in his chest. His name was Henry Bigfoot Hunter Calloway, though most folks just called him Hank when they weren't telling stories about his exploits. He stood 6 feet tall in his worn boots, broad-shouldered and lean-waisted, with the kind of weathered look that came from spending more time under open sky than under any roof. His dark hair hung past his collar, shot through with premature silver, and his beard was thick enough to protect his face from mountain wind. But it was his eyes that folks remembered, pale blue like winter sky, with the patient, watchful quality of something that had learned to see what others missed. He'd earned his reputation tracking things through country that killed other men just for trying to cross it. Cavalry units hired him to guide them through hostile territory where one wrong turn meant death for 30 soldiers. Mining camps paid him to hunt the creatures that killed their workers: mountain lions, bears, wolves, and stranger things that left tracks too big for any known animal. The stories said he tracked and killed 3 of the legendary beasts that gave him his name, though Hank never confirmed or denied the tales. He just did his job and collected his pay and disappeared back into the wilderness like smoke. But tracking monsters hadn't prepared him for what he saw when he looked into Mary's eyes. She didn't blink when their gazes met. The frost clung to his dark beard, his leather coat scarred from countless encounters with claws and fangs and the razor-sharp branches of high country timber. The cold made his breath visible in steady puffs, but he didn't shiver. Years in the mountains had taught him to conserve heat, to move efficiently, to recognize when the weather was trying to kill him. His rifle hung across his back within easy reach, and his hands rested naturally near the twin Colt revolvers at his hips. He was armed for war against anything the wilderness might send, but the woman in the cage posed a different kind of threat entirely. She was magnificent in the way that dangerous country was magnificent, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to ignore. Her shoulders were broader than those of most men, her arms thick with muscle earned through hard labor and harder survival. Scars crisscrossed her exposed skin like a map of violence, each mark telling a story of pain endured and overcome. Her hair was wild and uncombed, the color of mountain snow under starlight, and her hands where they gripped the bars were calloused and cracked from work no lady should have known. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. Gray as storm clouds, deep as mountain lakes, holding intelligence and fury and a grief so profound it made the winter air seem warm by comparison. These were not the eyes of a monster. These were the eyes of a woman who had stared into hell and walked back out carrying knowledge too heavy for any soul to bear. The sheriff was still counting coins when Hank interrupted, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like an axe through pine. "How much?" The sheriff squinted in the torchlight, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Samuel Morrison was a practical man, elected not because he was the best lawman but because he was the one most likely to survive the job. Silverpoint went through sheriffs the way other towns went through candles, quickly and with considerable mess. Morrison had lasted 2 years by being smart enough to know which fights to avoid and tough enough to win the ones he couldn't. "For the beast?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be that simple. Hank didn't turn his head, never breaking eye contact with Mary. His voice remained steady, pitched low enough that only those nearest could hear. "For the woman." The men around him chuckled like coyotes scenting weakness, all mockery and malicious amusement. These were hard men who had come to the mountains seeking easy fortune and found only brutal labor and constant danger. They took their entertainment where they found it, and the spectacle of the caged woman was the most interesting thing to happen in Silverpoint since the last avalanche had buried half the mining camp. "What's Bigfoot Hunter want with her?" someone jeered from the back of the crowd. "Finally found something bigger than what you usually track?" Another voice, slurred with whiskey and cold, "Maybe he figures she's part of whatever he's been hunting up in them peaks. Mate to one of them creatures, like. Hell, boy, you planning to breed yourself some monsters." The laughter that followed was ugly, the kind that came from men who had forgotten what it meant to be decent. But Hank just set the leather coin pouch down on the wooden crate beside him, the heavy thunk of gold and silver cutting through the mockery like a blade through flesh. The sound silenced the laughter as effectively as a gunshot in the mountain stillness. The sheriff studied him with the calculating eyes of a man who had learned to read character quickly and accurately. In a place like Silverpoint, being a poor judge of men could get you killed before breakfast. Calloway was known throughout the territory, one of the most skilled trackers in the American West. A man who had guided cavalry columns through Apache country and brought back miners' families from hostile wilderness. He'd saved more camps from beast attacks than any 10 men combined, and his reputation was built on the kind of competence that couldn't be faked. The idea of him buying the widow was so absurd it stilled the mountain wind for a heartbeat. "You're serious?" Morrison asked, wiping frost from his mustache with a gloved hand. "You want to buy her?" "Legal. I don't joke about business," Hank answered, his breath forming white clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. "And I don't make offers I can't back up." They all looked to the cage then, these hard men who thought they had seen everything the mountains could produce. Mary hadn't moved during the exchange, hadn't shown by so much as a blink that she understood what was being discussed. She watched Hank through the flickering torchlight, her massive frame casting dancing shadows on the snow-dusted ground around the wagon. Her knuckles were cracked and bleeding from the cold, her wild hair matted with ice crystals, her shoulders broader than those of any man in the circle. She looked like something the mountains had tried and failed to destroy, something that had been forged in the high country's merciless forge and come out stronger for the experience. And Hank looked like he'd already been shaped by those same unforgiving peaks, tempered by cold and altitude and the constant threat of violent death into something harder and more durable than ordinary men. He stood with the easy balance of someone who had learned to move on ice and loose rock, who could track a wounded bear through a blizzard or find water in country that looked like the surface of the moon. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, leather and wool and fur chosen for function over form, patched where necessary but well-maintained. This was a man who understood that in the mountains, your equipment was the difference between living and dying, and he treated it accordingly. He stepped closer to the cage, his boots crunching on the mixture of snow and frozen mud that passed for streets in Silverpoint. The sound was sharp in the cold air, each footstep precise and deliberate. "I'll take her now." The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly uncertain. Morrison had handled claim jumpers and drunken miners and the occasional outlaw, but this situation was outside his experience. There were rules about these things, procedures that had to be followed, paperwork that needed to be filed. The territorial government took a dim view of irregularities, especially when it came to matters involving women and property rights. There's formalities, Morrison said slowly. Legal requirements. She's not allowed to leave unless there's proper documentation. Marriage certificate, witnesses, the whole business. We need a preacher. Then find one, Hank cut in, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of commanding respect in situations where hesitation could get everyone killed. Because I'm not leaving without my wife. Gasps broke the silence like ice cracking on a frozen lake, sharp and sudden and followed by a profound stillness. Someone cursed creatively in 3 languages. A trapper with graying whiskers pulled his young son back by the collar, but no one dared move when Hank stepped up to the cage and placed his gloved hand against the iron bars. The metal was so cold it burned even through leather, but he didn't flinch. He'd endured worse things than frozen iron, avalanches that had buried him to the neck, blizzards that had lasted for days, attacks by creatures that left tracks the size of dinner plates. A little cold wasn't going to stop him from doing what needed to be done. "Mary," he said, his voice steady despite the vapor that rose from his words in the frigid air. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to own you or cage you or put you on display for these fools to gawk at. I'm here because..." He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between his intentions and her understanding. How did you explain to a woman who had been treated like an animal that someone finally saw her as human? How did you convince someone who had every reason to distrust the world that this time might be different? "I'm here because you deserve better than this," he finished simply. She didn't answer, not with words. But her eyes narrowed slightly, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read men's intentions in the set of their shoulders and the timbre of their voices. Her breath hitched once, a small sound that might have been surprise or hope or simple exhaustion. Then slowly, painfully, she leaned forward until the brutal mountain cold and flickering torchlight caught her face fully. It was not the face of a murderer or a monster. It was the face of a woman who had known too much violence, too many fists, too many nights without shelter or warmth or basic human kindness. But beneath the damage, beneath the scars and the weathered skin and the defensive wariness, there was something else. Intelligence. Dignity. A core of strength that even the mountain's worst cruelties hadn't been able to break. "You don't know what you're doing, Calloway," Sheriff Morrison muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "She ain't right in the head. 3 men dead, and that's just what we can prove. God knows what else she's done up in them canyons." Hank ignored him, never breaking eye contact with Mary. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding in their isolated mountain town. These people lived hard lives with little entertainment, and the spectacle of Bigfoot Hunter proposing marriage to the caged woman was better than anything the traveling medicine shows could offer. "Will you come with me?" Hank asked quietly, his question intended for her ears alone despite the pressing crowd. It was a request, not a demand. A choice offered freely, without coercion or threat. And maybe that's why, after a long silence filled only with the crackle of torches and the distant howl of something wild calling from the high peaks, she finally nodded once. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of a mountain avalanche. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, speculation and disbelief, and the kind of excitement that came from witnessing something unprecedented. Bets were quietly placed on whether the marriage would last a week, whether Mary would kill her new husband in his sleep, whether Hank had finally lost his mind to the thin mountain air. But Hank heard none of it. His world had narrowed to the woman in the cage and the trust she had just placed in him. It was a fragile thing, that trust, easily shattered and impossible to repair once broken. He would have to earn it with every word and action, prove himself worthy of the faith she had shown by agreeing to leave with him. "Sheriff," he said, straightening to his full height and turning to face Morrison. "I believe you mentioned needing a preacher." The chapel was a small log building wedged between a saloon and a general store, its walls thick enough to keep out some of the mountain cold but not all of it. The structure was relatively new, built after the town had grown large enough to support a full-time minister, but it already showed the weathering effects of high-altitude winters. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, and the single window was covered with oiled paper rather than expensive glass. A simple wooden cross adorned the front wall, carved by some craftsman whose name was forgotten but whose faith remained evident in every careful line. The mountain folk lined the walls inside, pretending not to stare while vapor rose from their breath in the unheated space. These were people who had learned to take their warmth where they found it, huddling close together and wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Their Sunday clothes were practical rather than fancy, wool and leather and fur that prioritized function over fashion. But they had made an effort, cleaning the mine dust from their faces and combing their hair, because even in a place like Silverpoint, marriage was considered a sacred thing worth witnessing properly. Mary's hands were still shackled, though Hank had insisted they loosen the chain enough for her to walk freely and stand without discomfort. The iron was old and rust-stained, the kind of restraints used for prisoners being transported long distances through hostile country. Every link was a reminder of how she had been treated, how the world saw her, what she was expected to become. But the loosened chain also represented possibility, the first small step toward something better. She wore a simple wool dress now, borrowed from the minister's wife, but it fit poorly across her broad shoulders and powerful frame. The fabric strained at the seams, unable to accommodate her unusual proportions, and the hem fell several inches short of where it should have reached. It was clean and mended and offered with Christian charity, but it couldn't disguise the network of scars that crossed her exposed arms or the calloused hands that spoke of hard labor and harder survival. She was taller than Hank by half a head and broader by far, a fact that drew whispers and pointed stares from the assembled witnesses. In a country where size often meant survival, where physical strength could be the difference between life and death, her proportions suggested capabilities that made some folks nervous. But Hank seemed untroubled by the disparity, standing beside her with the calm confidence of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and legendary beasts without flinching. The preacher was a thin, nervous man named Reverend Michaels who had come west seeking souls to save and found mostly miners who preferred their salvation in liquid form. He wasn't a bad man, just one who had expected frontier ministry to be different from what he'd discovered. The isolation wore on him, and the constant struggle to maintain Christian values in a place where survival often required compromise had left him uncertain and anxious. But he knew his duty, and he performed it with whatever dignity he could muster. When he spoke the vows, his voice cracked from the cold and from nervousness at officiating such an unusual ceremony. The words echoed strangely in the small space, made hollow by the frigid air and the weight of what was being witnessed. Marriage was supposed to be about love and commitment and shared dreams, but this felt more like a business transaction with spiritual overtones, necessary but somehow incomplete. Do you, Henry Calloway, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Hank said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the small building. And do you? Reverend Michaels paused, realizing he had never gotten the bride's full name. Do you, Mary, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse and cold, but it carried clearly in the absolute stillness that had fallen over the chapel. I do. Hank said his part loud enough for both of them, his commitment ringing through the small space like a bell. There was no ring, such luxuries were rare in mining towns, and this ceremony had been arranged too quickly for such preparations. There was no kiss, Mary's wariness was too evident, her fear too fresh for such intimacy. There was just a signed ledger, two names written in careful script, and a murmur of disbelief as they turned to face their witnesses. No one cheered. No one threw rice or flower petals. No one wished them well or offered congratulations. The assembled crowd watched in fascination and uncertainty as Hank offered Mary his arm and escorted her toward the door. Some crossed themselves, whether in blessing or protection it was hard to say. Others shook their heads and muttered about the strange ways of mountain folk. A few looked genuinely moved by what they had witnessed, the spectacle of a man offering dignity and choice to someone who had been denied both. They stepped back into the brutal mountain night that hit them like a physical slap, the temperature having dropped even further while they were inside. The wind had picked up, driving snow crystals through the air like tiny knives, and the torches that had lit their ceremony flickered and guttered in the gusts. Hank helped Mary onto the seat of his wagon, spreading thick buffalo robes over her legs and shoulders for warmth, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It's 3 days' ride to my place," he told her, his voice almost lost in the wind. "We'll stop for shelter when we need it, rest when the horses need rest. No rush, no hurry." She didn't speak, just nodded and pulled the furs closer around her body. The cold was already penetrating the wool dress, seeking out every gap in her defenses, but she endured it with the stoic patience of someone who had learned to survive whatever the mountains chose to inflict. Her hands, freed now from the shackles, flexed slowly as circulation returned to her fingers. The metal had left raw marks around her wrists, testament to how long she had worn the restraints. The journey began in silence, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground, the snorting of horses in the thin air, and the constant whisper of wind through the pine boughs that pressed close on either side of the narrow mountain road. This was not a path for the inexperienced or unprepared. It wound through country that could kill the unwary with avalanches, blizzards, predators, or simple exposure. But Hank navigated it with the confidence of someone who knew every turn and hazard, who could read the mountain's moods in the behavior of his horses and the sound of the wind. The first day passed like a dream wrapped in cold fog. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than a trail carved from the wilderness by necessity and maintained by the occasional passage of supply wagons and determined travelers. It wound upward through forests of pine and spruce, following ridgelines and creek beds, occasionally opening onto spectacular vistas of snow-covered peaks that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The beauty was breathtaking and terrible, the kind that reminded humans of their insignificance in the face of forces beyond their comprehension or control. They stopped at midday in a sheltered grove where previous travelers had built a rough lean-to from fallen logs and pine boughs. The structure provided some protection from the wind, and Hank quickly built a small fire from deadfall, coaxing flames from tinder with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times in hostile conditions. The warmth was a blessing, a small circle of comfort in a world that seemed dedicated to freezing everything solid. Mary sat motionless beside the fire, conserving energy and heat with the instinctive wisdom of mountain survival. She had pulled the buffalo robes around herself like armor against the cold, and only her eyes were visible above the fur. They reflected the firelight like those of a wild creature, alert and watchful, ready to react to any threat or opportunity. But there was something else there too, a profound exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting for survival so long she had forgotten what peace felt like. Hank heated beans and salt pork in a cast-iron pot, the simple meal made precious by the circumstances. Food was fuel in country like this, the difference between maintaining body heat and succumbing to the cold that waited patiently for any sign of weakness. He served Mary first, a courtesy that seemed to surprise her, then sat across the fire to eat his own portion. The flames danced between them, creating an intimate space in the vast wilderness, a temporary sanctuary against the indifferent hostility of the mountains. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice hoarse from the dry mountain air and long disuse. It was the first word she had spoken since the chapel, and it carried the weight of genuine bewilderment. Hank didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the flames, watching the way they consumed the pine needles and sent sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. Around them, the forest was coming alive with night sounds, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the settling and creaking of trees in the wind. These were the sounds he knew best, the audio landscape of his chosen home, but tonight they seemed different somehow. Tonight, he wasn't alone. "I lost someone," he said finally, his words barely audible above the crackle of burning wood. "Long time ago. Before I became what folks call me, before I learned to track the things that leave big footprints in the snow. Her name was Sarah, and she deserved better than what this world gave her." Mary turned away, her jaw tightening, and for the first time, Hank saw something crack behind her silence. Not anger, not fear, but grief so profound it seemed to emanate from her like heat from the fire. It was the grief of someone who understood loss at the cellular level, who had been shaped by it into something harder and more resilient but also more fragile in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "I think maybe you did too," he added softly. "Lost someone who deserved better." She didn't respond, but her hands clenched into fists beneath the buffalo robes, and her breathing changed in a way that suggested she was fighting back tears. The conversation ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because some things were too big for words, too painful to examine in the harsh light of campfire honesty. They slept that night in the lean-to, separated by the dying fire but sharing the same small space of relative warmth and safety. Hank had offered her his blankets, but she had refused, settling instead for half of the buffalo robes while he made do with his own coat and what remained of the fire's heat. It was a gesture of independence, of self-sufficiency, and he respected it even as he worried about her comfort through the long, brutal night. The second day brought them higher into the mountains, following a trail that seemed to defy both logic and gravity as it switchbacked up slopes so steep that walking beside the wagon was often safer than riding in it. The air grew thinner, making both humans and horses work harder for each breath, and the cold became more intense, a living thing that sought out every weakness in their defenses. Snow began falling around midday, thick flakes that muffled sound and turned the world into a white wilderness where landmarks disappeared and direction became a matter of faith and experience. But Hank never hesitated, never showed uncertainty about their path. He had traveled this route dozens of times in every kind of weather, and he read the country like a familiar book, finding his way by the shape of distant peaks and the lay of the land beneath the snow. His horses trusted him completely, following his guidance even when their instincts suggested they should seek shelter and wait for better conditions. Mary watched everything with the intense focus of someone learning a new language. She observed how he managed the horses on steep sections, how he chose their rest stops, how he read the sky for signs of worsening weather. Her questions, when she asked them, were practical and intelligent, focused on the skills she would need to survive in this environment. It became clear that she was not content to be a passenger in her own life, that she intended to learn whatever was necessary to pull her own weight in this partnership. "Storm coming," she said late in the afternoon, nodding toward the western horizon where dark clouds were building against the peaks. Hank glanced where she indicated, noting the way the wind had shifted and the particular quality of light that preceded serious mountain weather. "You're right. We'll need to find shelter soon." "How much further to your place?" "Half a day in good weather. Longer if this gets bad." Mary studied the approaching storm with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that weather in the mountains could kill as efficiently as any weapon. "There," she said, pointing to a rocky outcropping ahead and to their left. "Looks like there might be an overhang." Hank followed her gesture and saw what she had spotted, a natural formation that could provide protection from wind and precipitation. It wasn't much, but it was better than being caught in the open when the storm hit. "Good eye," he said, turning the wagon toward the rocks. They reached shelter just as the first serious gusts arrived, carrying snow so thick it reduced visibility to a few yards. The overhang was larger than it had appeared from a distance, deep enough to accommodate both the wagon and the horses, high enough that they could stand upright beneath its protection. Previous travelers had used this spot, leaving behind the remains of old fires and rough improvements to make the space more habitable. Within an hour, they had established a comfortable camp. Hank built a fire against the back wall of the overhang, where the smoke would be drawn up and out by the natural chimney effect of the rock formation. Mary tended the horses, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass she found stored in the back of the wagon, checking their hooves for ice, making sure they were as comfortable as possible in the cramped conditions. The storm raged through the night and into the next morning, one of those mountain tempests that reminded humans how small and vulnerable they really were. Wind howled through the rocks above them, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and piling it in drifts that would take days to melt. The temperature dropped so far that their breath froze in the air, and the fire became not just comfort but necessity, the difference between life and death. But inside their stone shelter, warmed by flames and protected from the worst of the weather, something began to change between them. Mary started talking, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized that Hank listened without judgment or interruption. She told him about her life before the cage, about the small mountain cabin where she had lived with her husband and son, about the simple happiness she had known before everything went wrong. Her husband had been a trapper, she explained, a man who understood the mountains and respected their power. They had been happy together, building a life in harmony with the harsh environment, raising their boy to be strong and self-reliant and kind. But happiness in the mountains was always precarious, always subject to forces beyond human control. Raiders came through one winter, she said, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. Not Indians, white men, deserters from the army, I think. They wanted our supplies, our furs, anything of value. Jacob, my husband, he tried to fight them off. She paused, staring into the fire as if she could see the past in its flames. They killed him, beat him to death while I watched, while they made me watch. Then they... She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue that part of the story. My boy, Thomas, he was only 8. Smart as a whip, brave as his daddy, but just a little boy. They took him when they left, said they could sell him to someone who needed a strong worker. I followed them, tracked them for 3 days through country that should have killed me. When I found their camp, her voice hardened. I killed them. All 4 of them. Used Jacob's skinning knife in my own bare hands. Hank didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He just listened, understanding that this was not a story she had ever told before, that the words were being pulled from some deep place where she had buried them. But it was too late, Mary continued. Thomas was already gone. They'd sold him to a mining outfit, and by the time I tracked them down, he'd died in a cave-in. 8 years old, and he died in the dark, alone, scared, wondering where his mama was. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of wind outside their shelter. Finally, Mary looked directly at Hank, her eyes reflecting the firelight like those of some wild creature. That's when I went crazy for a while. Started living rough, hunting the men who bought and sold children like livestock. Killed maybe a dozen before they caught me. The stories they tell about me, most of them are true. I did become something monstrous, something that belonged in a cage. Hank met her gaze steadily. And now I don't know what I am, she admitted. But sitting here, talking to you, listening to that storm, for the first time in years, I feel almost human again. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. They emerged from their shelter to find the trail buried under 3 feet of fresh powder, the trees bent under the weight of ice, the entire landscape sculpted into new and alien forms. It was beautiful and terrible, the kind of scene that belonged on Christmas cards but could kill the unprepared without mercy. But Hank had prepared for such conditions. He broke out snowshoes for both of them and rigged the wagon with runners that would allow it to slide over the surface rather than bog down in the depths. The horses were equipped with special shoes that provided traction on ice, and their harness was adjusted to give them better leverage in the difficult conditions. The final day of their journey took them through country so spectacular it seemed unreal, vast expanses of untouched snow, forests that looked like crystal cathedrals, peaks that pierced the sky like the spears of sleeping giants. But it was also exhausting travel, requiring constant attention to avoid hidden dangers. Avalanche slopes, ice-covered stream crossings, places where the trail simply disappeared under snow drifts that might be 6 inches deep or 60 feet. Mary proved herself invaluable during this final push. Her strength was obvious as she helped manhandle the wagon through difficult sections, but it was her intelligence and adaptability that truly impressed Hank. She learned to read the snow conditions, to spot the subtle signs that warned of unstable slopes, to judge the safety of stream crossings. By the end of the day, she was making decisions about their route with the confidence of someone who belonged in this environment. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose, they crested a final ridge and looked down into a hidden valley that took Mary's breath away. It was a natural sanctuary, protected on all sides by steep slopes that would deter all but the most determined visitors. A stream ran through the center, its water dark and quick-flowing despite the cold, and groves of aspen and pine provided both beauty and practical resources. And there, on a slight rise overlooking the stream, stood a cabin that was clearly the work of a master craftsman. It was built from massive logs, each one carefully selected and fitted with the precision of someone who understood that sloppy work in the mountains meant death when winter came calling. The roof was steep to shed snow, reinforced with heavy beams that could support tremendous weight. The walls were chinked with a mixture of mud and moss that would expand and contract with the seasons, maintaining a tight seal against wind and moisture. Multiple chimneys promised warmth throughout the structure, and the windows, real glass, not paper or hide, spoke of prosperity and permanence. "Home," Hank said simply. Mary stared at the cabin, the valley, the entire scene spread out before them like a promise of peace. After years of running, of surviving day to day in hostile country, of never knowing where she would sleep or whether she would wake up alive, the sight of genuine shelter was almost overwhelming. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's ours," Hank replied, and the possessive pronoun carried weight beyond simple ownership. It suggested belonging, partnership, shared responsibility for something worth protecting. They descended into the valley as full darkness fell, guided by the warm glow of oil lamps that Hank had left burning in the windows. The horses sensed that their journey was ending and quickened their pace despite their exhaustion. Even the wind seemed to quiet as they approached the cabin, as if the valley itself offered sanctuary from the harsh realities of mountain life. Hank helped Mary down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful, offering support without presuming intimacy. Her feet touched the ground of her new home for the first time, and she stood for a moment just breathing the thin, clean air and looking around at the place where she would build whatever came next. "Welcome home, Mary Calloway," Hank said softly. She turned to look at him, this man who had bought her freedom and offered her his name, and for the first time in years, she smiled. It was a small expression, hesitant and unpracticed, but it transformed her entire face. The hard lines softened, the wariness faded, and for a moment she looked like the woman she might have been if the world had been kinder. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't yet express. The cabin was even more impressive inside than it had appeared from the valley floor. Hank had built it with both comfort and practicality in mind, understanding that in the mountains, your home was fortress, workshop, and sanctuary all in one. The main room was spacious, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that radiated warmth throughout the space. Hand-hewn furniture, chairs, tables, shelves, showed the work of a craftsman who understood that quality construction was not luxury but necessity. The kitchen was well equipped with cast iron pots and pans, a good supply of preserved foods, and a wood-burning stove that would provide both cooking heat and additional warmth. Root vegetables hung from the rafters alongside strings of dried meat and herbs. Everything spoke of careful preparation, of a man who understood that winter in the mountains could last 6 months and that survival depended on planning ahead. "I'll sleep in the workshop if you'd prefer," Hank offered as he showed her around. "Give you time to get settled, figure out how you want things arranged." Mary paused in her examination of the cabin's appointments. "No," she said firmly. "This is your home. I won't drive you out of it on my first night here." "It's our home now," he corrected gently. "But I want you to be comfortable. We can take this as slow as you need." She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for deception or hidden motives and finding none. "I haven't shared a roof with a man in 5 years," she admitted. "Haven't trusted one in longer than that." "Then we start building that trust tonight," Hank said. "One day at a time, one choice at a time, until you know for certain that you're safe here." They settled into an evening routine with surprising ease. Mary explored the cabin more thoroughly while Hank tended to the horses and secured their supplies from the journey. She found spare blankets in a cedar chest, extra clothing that would need to be altered to fit her frame, and books, actual books, more than she had seen in one place since childhood. The titles ranged from practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy. This was the library of an educated man, someone who valued knowledge as much as skill. When Hank returned from his chores, he found her sitting by the fire with a worn copy of Walt Whitman's poetry in her lap. She looked up as he entered, and he caught a glimpse of the intelligence that lurked behind her careful defenses. "You read," he observed. "My father was a schoolteacher before we came west," she replied. "He made sure I could read and cipher and think for myself. Said it was the one thing nobody could take away from me." Her smile turned bitter. He was wrong about that last part, but the reading stuck. Hank prepared their evening meal, venison stew with vegetables from his root cellar, cornbread baked in a Dutch oven, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The familiar routine of cooking grounded him, providing structure for an evening that felt charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. They ate in companionable silence, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind outside providing a peaceful soundtrack. Mary ate with the focused intensity of someone who had known real hunger, but she paced herself, clearly fighting the instinct to consume everything available while she had the chance. It would take time, Hank realized, for her to truly believe that food would be available tomorrow, and the day after, and for all the days that followed. "Tell me about the creatures you track," she said eventually, setting down her empty bowl. "The ones that give you your name." Hank leaned back in his chair, considering how much to reveal. The stories people told about his exploits were mostly exaggerated, growing in the telling until they bore little resemblance to reality. But there were things in the mountains, creatures that left tracks too big for any known animal, that moved with intelligence and purpose through country that challenged even experienced woodsmen. "Folks call them different names," he said finally. "Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wood devils. Most think they're just stories, tall tales told around campfires to scare children. But I've seen the tracks, followed sign that no bear or man ever made. And they're real. Rare, maybe dying out, but real. They're smart, probably smarter than we are in some ways. They know this country better than any human ever will, and they've learned to avoid us mostly. But sometimes," he paused, staring into the fire. "Sometimes they get hungry or desperate or just curious. That's when people see them, when livestock goes missing, when camps get raided." Mary leaned forward, genuinely interested. "You've killed them?" "3 over the years. But only when there was no choice, when they'd started killing people or were too sick or injured to survive on their own. Mostly I just track them, learn their patterns, try to understand how they live." "Why?" Hank was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to explain something he'd never discussed with anyone. "Because they're the last of something," he said finally. "Something old and wild and free that doesn't fit in the world we're building. Once they're gone, they'll be gone forever, and we'll be a little poorer for losing them." Mary nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Like me," she said softly. "Like you," he agreed. "Something the world wants to cage or destroy because it doesn't fit the usual patterns. But that doesn't make it wrong. Just different." The conversation continued deep into the night, ranging across topics both personal and philosophical. Mary told him more about her life before tragedy struck, the simple pleasures of mountain living, the satisfaction of work well done, the deep contentment that came from being in harmony with the natural world. Hank shared his own history, the loss of his first love to consumption, the restless years that had followed, the gradual discovery that he had a talent for reading sign and surviving in conditions that broke other men. "I never thought I'd marry again," he admitted as the fire burned low. "Figured I was too set in my ways, too used to being alone." "What changed your mind?" Mary asked. He looked at her directly, his pale eyes serious in the firelight. "Seeing you in that cage. Knowing that someone like you, someone strong and intelligent and decent, could be reduced to a spectacle for fools to gawk at. It made me angry, and it made me realize that maybe being alone wasn't something to be proud of." Mary was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "I don't know if I remember how to be with someone," she said eventually. "It's been so long since I trusted anyone, since I let myself care about what happened to another person." "We'll learn together," Hank said simply. "No rush, no pressure. Just two people trying to figure out how to build something good in a hard world." That night, Mary slept in the cabin's main room on a comfortable bed that Hank had prepared with clean sheets and warm blankets. It was the first real bed she'd known in years, The first time she'd slept indoors without fear or expectation of violence. The walls were solid around her, the fire provided steady warmth, and for the first time since her son's death, she felt truly safe. Hank took the smaller room that served as his office, giving her space and privacy while remaining close enough to provide protection if needed. He lay awake for hours listening to the sounds of the mountain night wind in the pines, the distant howl of wolves, the settling of logs as the cabin adjusted to the changing temperature. But there were new sounds now too, the soft breathing of another person, the quiet rustle of someone turning in sleep. The cabin felt different with Mary in it, more complete somehow, as if it had been waiting for her arrival to become truly home. In the morning, he found her outside before dawn, already working despite the bitter cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made exposed skin ache within minutes. She had hauled wood from the pile beside the cabin, started a fire in the outdoor pit they used for larger cooking tasks, and was melting snow for wash water in a large kettle. When she saw him approaching, she handed him a cup of coffee without a word, the simple gesture carrying implications of domesticity and partnership that made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. "You don't have to work so hard," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We're not in a hurry, and this cold can kill if you're not careful." "I do better when I work," she replied, echoing words she'd spoken during their journey. "And the cold doesn't bother me much anymore. I think I lost the ability to feel warm when Thomas died." It was the first time she'd mentioned her son by name since telling the story of his death, and Hank understood the significance of the moment. Names had power, especially the names of the lost. Speaking them aloud was both tribute and torment, a way of keeping memory alive at the cost of reopening old wounds. "Tell me about him," he said gently. Mary paused in her work, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. For a moment, Hank thought she would refuse, would retreat back into the protective silence that had kept her grief private. But then she began to speak, and her voice carried warmth despite the cold that surrounded them. He was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why they were the way they were. Jacob used to say he'd either become a scholar or get himself killed trying to understand something that was better left alone. She smiled at the memory, the expression soft and painful at the same time. He could track almost as well as his father by the time he was 6. Read the forest like other children read books. She continued working as she talked, her hands moving efficiently despite the temperature that made metal burn to the touch. The physical activity seemed to help her process the emotions that talking about Thomas brought to the surface, giving her something concrete to focus on while the memories washed over her. "He would have loved this place," she said, gesturing toward the valley that surrounded them. "All this space to explore, all these mountains to climb. He dreamed of seeing country like this, of living somewhere wild and free where a person could be themselves without worrying about what others thought." "He'd have been proud of his mother," Hank said softly. "For surviving, for fighting back, for not letting them break her completely." Mary's hands stilled for a moment, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't feel like someone to be proud of. I feel like someone who lost the most important thing in the world and then turned into something monstrous trying to get it back." "You feel like someone who loved her child enough to move heaven and earth trying to save him," Hank corrected. "And when that wasn't possible, someone who made sure the men responsible paid for what they did. That's not monstrous. That's human." The days passed in a rhythm of work and discovery as they learned to live together in the isolated valley. Mary threw herself into the practical tasks of mountain living with an intensity that spoke of deep-seated need to contribute, to prove her worth through action. She took over many of the daily chores, hauling water from the stream, maintaining the fires, preparing meals from their stores of preserved foods. But it was clear that she was also fighting a deeper battle, struggling to find her place in a world that suddenly offered safety and kindness instead of threats and violence. Hank watched her carefully, ready to offer help or support without presuming to know what she needed. He had lived alone for so long that sharing space with another person required constant adjustment, but he found himself adapting to her presence with surprising ease. She was quiet but not withdrawn, helpful but not subservient, strong but not domineering. The balance they struck felt natural, as if they had been designed to complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. The physical attraction between them was undeniable but unspoken, manifesting in stolen glances and moments of accidental contact that left both of them aware of possibilities they weren't yet ready to explore. Mary's wariness ran too deep, her trust too fragile, for anything beyond the most careful courtship. And Hank, despite his growing feelings for her, understood that pushing too hard or too fast would destroy the delicate progress they were making. But there were moments, when she laughed at something he said, when she touched his arm in passing, when she looked at him with something approaching warmth in her storm-gray eyes, that suggested the future might hold more than simple partnership. One morning, as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by the weight of snow, Mary asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me from that cage, bringing me here?" Hank paused in his hammering to look at her directly. She stood with an armload of fence posts, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, her expression carefully neutral in the way he'd learned meant she was bracing for disappointment. "No," he said simply. "Not for a moment. Even though you barely knew me? Even though I might have been everything they said I was?" "Especially then," he replied. "Someone who stands up for strangers, who offers help without knowing whether it will be appreciated or thrown back in their face. That tells me more about their character than any amount of reputation or rumor." Mary was quiet for a moment, processing his words. Then she moved closer, close enough that he could see the individual snowflakes caught in her dark hair, close enough to smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her clothes. "I'm starting to care about you," she said quietly. "About what happens to you, about whether you're happy or sad or worried. And that terrifies me, because caring about people has only brought me pain." Hank set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "It terrifies me too," he admitted. "But I think maybe that's the point. If it didn't matter enough to be frightening, it wouldn't be worth doing. And if I'm not ready? If I can't be what you need me to be? Then we'll figure it out together," he said. "No expectations, no demands. Just two people trying to build something good one day at a time." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden agendas and finding none. Then, slowly and deliberately, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the morning air but strong and steady, and the simple contact sent warmth racing up his arm to settle somewhere in the region of his heart. "One day at a time," she agreed. The work of building trust and intimacy continued through the short winter days and long mountain nights. They established routines that brought them together for meals and evening conversations while still allowing each of them space for solitude and reflection. Mary began to smile more often, to laugh at Hank's stories of his trekking adventures, to share memories of her life before tragedy struck that revealed the intelligent, capable woman she had been before violence forced her to become something else. Hank found himself looking forward to their evenings by the fire, to the sound of her voice reading aloud from his books, to the comfortable silence that could fall between them without awkwardness or tension. She was teaching him things too, how to preserve certain types of food he'd never worked with, techniques for working leather that she'd learned from her first husband, ways of reading weather signs that were specific to this particular region of the mountains. But it was the small moments that mattered most. The way she automatically handed him coffee in the morning, the manner in which she mended his clothes without being asked, the protective way she watched the tree lean when they worked outside together. She was claiming her place in his life through actions rather than words, staking her territory in the quiet, determined way of someone who had learned that survival often depended on making yourself indispensable. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm battered the valley with wind and snow, they sat closer together than usual for warmth and comfort. The fire burned brightly in the hearth, but the cold seemed to seep through the walls despite the cabin's solid construction. Mary had wrapped herself in a heavy quilt, but Hank could see that she was still shivering despite her proximity to the flames. Without speaking, he opened his arms in invitation. She hesitated for only a moment before moving to sit beside him, allowing him to pull her against his side and share his warmth. She was larger than most women, but she fit against him perfectly, her head finding a natural resting place against his shoulder, her body relaxing as his arms closed around her. "Better?" he asked softly. Much, she replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't talking only about the physical warmth. They stayed like that for the rest of the evening, watching the fire burn down to coals while the storm raged outside. Neither spoke much, but both understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, that they had crossed an invisible line from careful alliance into something deeper and more meaningful. When it came time for sleep, Mary didn't immediately retreat to her own bed. Instead, she looked at Hank with an expression that mixed vulnerability with determination. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said quietly. "Not with the storm, not with the memories it brings back. But I need you to understand that I'm not ready for everything. Not yet." "I understand," Hank replied, and he did. The intimacy she was offering was about comfort and connection rather than passion, about the basic human need for warmth and companionship in the face of a hostile world. They arranged themselves carefully in his bed, Mary curled against his side with her back to his chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. She fit against him perfectly, as if they had been designed to sleep this way, and the steady rhythm of her breathing eventually lulled him into the deepest sleep he'd known in years. In the morning, they woke naturally, without awkwardness or regret. Mary made coffee while Hank checked the cabin for storm damage, and they went about their morning routine as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, in ways both subtle and profound. There was an ease between them now that hadn't existed before, a comfort with shared space and casual contact that spoke of growing intimacy and trust. The storm had left the valley transformed, with snow drifts that reached nearly to the cabin's eaves and ice formations that turned the stream into a sculpture garden. But inside their sanctuary, warmth and companionship made the harsh conditions seem like nothing more than nature's way of encouraging them to appreciate what they had built together. "Spring will come eventually," Hank observed as they looked out at the winter landscape through the cabin's windows. "It always does," Mary agreed. "But I think I'm beginning to like winter." The months that followed brought both challenges and revelations as they settled into their partnership. Mary's strength and practical skills proved invaluable for managing the demanding work of mountain living, while her intelligence and education made her an engaging companion for the long evenings when outside work was impossible. But it was her gradual emotional awakening that moved Hank most deeply, the way she slowly allowed herself to hope for things beyond simple survival. She began planning improvements to the cabin and grounds, sketching additions that would make their home more comfortable and efficient. She talked about planting a garden in the spring, about expanding the root cellar, about building a proper smokehouse for preserving meat. These were the dreams of someone who expected to have a future, who believed that investment of time and effort would pay dividends in years to come. But the past had not finished with them yet, and it arrived one morning in early spring in the form of strangers with guns and badges and the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Hank saw them first, 3 riders picking their way carefully down the mountain trail that led to their valley. Even at a distance, their purpose was clear from the way they rode, alert, professional, armed for trouble. He called Mary inside and checked his weapons while she watched from the window, her face pale but determined. "Law?" she asked. "Has to be. Nobody else would come calling in country like this unless they had official business." The riders were led by a tall man with graying whiskers and a federal marshal's badge pinned to his coat. His companions looked like deputies or hired guns, the kind of men who made their living enforcing other people's will through violence or the threat of it. They rode directly to the cabin without hesitation, suggesting they knew exactly who they were looking for and where to find them. "Henry Calloway?" the marshal called out when they were still 20 yards away, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "That's me," Hank replied, stepping onto the porch with his rifle held casually but ready. "Marshal William Hayes, Territorial Authority. I'm looking for a woman named Mary Whitaker, also known as Mary Vance and several other names. Wanted in connection with multiple murders in Colorado Territory." "She's my wife," Hank said evenly. "Mary Calloway now, legally married according to territorial law." "That may be," Hayes replied, dismounting but keeping his horse between himself and the cabin. "But marriage doesn't erase outstanding warrants. I'll need to speak with her." Mary appeared in the doorway, moving to stand beside Hank with her chin raised defiantly. She had grown stronger and more confident during their months together, but faced with official authority, some of her old wariness returned. "I'm Mary Calloway," she said clearly. "What do you want with me?" Marshall Hayes studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. "You're accused of killing 4 men in cold blood, ma'am. There's witnesses, evidence, a clear pattern of violence. I'm here to take you back to stand trial." "Those men killed my husband and sold my child into slavery," Mary replied, her voice steady despite the tension that radiated from her frame. "I did what any mother would do." "Maybe so," Hayes said, "but that's for a jury to decide, not for you to settle with violence." Hank stepped forward, putting himself partially between Mary and the marshal. "She's not going anywhere," he said quietly. "She's paid enough for what happened to her family." "I understand your feelings, Calloway. Truly I do. But I have a job to do, and I'll do it with or without your cooperation." The standoff stretched taut between them, 3 armed lawmen facing 2 desperate people who had found something worth protecting in their mountain sanctuary. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as if commenting on the drama unfolding below. Then Mary made the decision that changed everything. "I'll go," she said quietly. "No," Hank said immediately. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." She looked at him with eyes that held both love and determination. "I won't have you die for me, and I won't live the rest of my life as a fugitive. If there's going to be justice, let it be real justice, in a courtroom with a judge and jury." "Mary, I've been running for 5 years," she interrupted. "I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of feeling like something less than human. If I'm going to claim the life I want, the life we've started building together, then I need to face this." Marshall Hayes watched this exchange with something approaching respect. "Mrs. Calloway," he said formally, "I give you my word that you'll be treated fairly and according to law. No more cages, no more spectacle. A proper trial with proper representation." Mary nodded slowly. "Then let's get it over with." The journey back to civilization was a bitter reversal of her trip to freedom months earlier. But this time, she rode as a woman with dignity and purpose rather than as a caged animal on display. Marshall Hayes proved true to his word, treating her with courtesy and ensuring that his deputies did the same. Still, the shackles felt heavy on her wrists, and the gradual return to populated areas brought back all the old anxieties about how people would see her, what they would expect her to be. Hank rode with them, having refused to be separated from his wife despite the marshal's suggestions that his presence might complicate matters. He had business to attend to, he explained, witnesses to locate, lawyers to hire, character references to gather. Mary's fate would not be decided by legal procedure alone but by the quality of her representation and the willingness of people to see her as human rather than monster. The trial, when it finally came, was unlike anything the territorial court had seen before. The prosecutor painted Mary as a dangerous killer who had taken the law into her own hands, a woman whose size and strength made her a threat to civilized society. But Hank had used their time well, bringing forward witnesses who testified to the character of the men she had killed, to their involvement in the slave trade that had cost her son his life, to the systematic violence they had visited on others before Mary stopped them permanently. The defense lawyer, paid for with the last of Hank's savings, presented Mary not as a monster but as a mother driven to desperate action by unimaginable loss. He brought forward testimony about the conditions Thomas had endured before his death, about the legal system's failure to protect children from exploitation, about the impossible choice Mary had faced between justice and law. Mary herself testified for over an hour, telling her story in her own words with a dignity and pain that moved many in the courtroom to tears. She didn't deny what she had done or try to minimize the violence of her actions. Instead, she explained the context, the desperation, the crushing weight of loss that had driven her to become something she never wanted to be. "I killed those men," she said clearly, "and I would kill them again if it meant saving one child from what they did to my son. But I don't want to be a killer anymore. I want to be a woman, a wife, a member of a community that believes in justice rather than revenge." I want to be someone my son would be proud to call his mother." The jury deliberated for 2 days, returning with a verdict that surprised many and satisfied few. Guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, with a sentence of time already served and a requirement that she remain in the territory under legal supervision for 5 years. It was compromise justice, acknowledging both the wrongness of her actions and the circumstances that had driven them. Mary and Hank returned to their mountain valley that summer, legally married, legally free, but forever changed by their brush with the machinery of law and order. They had learned that justice was not always just, that survival sometimes required becoming something monstrous, and that redemption was possible even for those who had traveled to the darkest places of human experience. The years that followed brought peace and prosperity to their high country home. They expanded the cabin, built outbuildings, developed their land into a productive homestead that could support not just themselves but visitors and friends. Mary's strength and Hank's wilderness skills made them valuable neighbors to the few other hardy souls who chose to make their homes in the mountains, and their reputation for hospitality and fairness spread throughout the region. Children came, not their own biological offspring, but youngsters who found their way to the valley through various circumstances. Orphans from mining accidents, runaways from abusive situations, children whose parents had died and left them with nowhere else to go. Mary and Hank took them in, gave them homes and education and the kind of fierce protection that came from people who understood what it meant to lose the most important things in life. The cabin grew again to accommodate their expanding family, becoming something between a homestead and a school where practical skills were taught alongside reading and arithmetic. Mary proved to be a gifted teacher, patient with slow learners and challenging for quick ones, able to help children understand that education was power and that power could be used to build rather than destroy. Hank continued his tracking work but closer to home now, helping local communities deal with problem animals and occasionally guiding parties through difficult country. His reputation grew with the years, but the stories told about him became less about the monsters he had killed and more about the people he had helped, the communities he had served, the family he had built in the high country. On Mary's 50th birthday, sitting on the porch of their expanded home with grandchildren playing in the yard and the sound of laughter echoing off the mountain walls, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The caged woman seemed like someone from another lifetime, a tragic figure who had existed before Mary learned what it meant to be truly free. "Any regrets?" Hank asked, taking her hand in his weathered fingers. Mary considered the question seriously, looking out over the valley that had become not just their home but their legacy. The children they had raised were spread throughout the territory now, building lives and families of their own, carrying forward the values of strength tempered with compassion that they had learned in these mountains. "About the killing, yes," she said finally. "I wish there had been another way, wish I could have saved Thomas without becoming something monstrous. But about everything else, about trusting you, about building this life, about opening our home to children who needed what we could give them, no regrets at all." Hank squeezed her hand gently. "Thomas would be proud of his mother," he said softly. "Proud of what she survived, what she built, what she became." Mary smiled, the expression warm and peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. "I like to think so. I like to think he's watching somehow, seeing that his death wasn't meaningless, that it led to something good in the end." The sun set behind the familiar peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that never grew old no matter how many times they witnessed the display. In the distance, wolves called to each other across the valleys, and somewhere even further away, something large and mysterious moved through the forest, leaving tracks that would puzzle trackers for generations to come. But in their valley, surrounded by the family they had chosen and the life they had built together, Mary and Hank Calloway sat in contentment, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky and knowing that they had found something precious in the harsh country that had tried so hard to break them both. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.